Hello, everyone, and welcome to Psych 2, Biopsychology. I am your professor, Dr. B. Um, I figure there's about 21 slides in this chapter, so I may just go ahead and do it all in one straight shot. The nice thing about this class is this is the class that I've taught online since the beginning. I've had classes on ground and online. So you will not only get the lectures from me, but you will also have written, the written text basically of everything. So you have um, more than one way to absorb the information. So without further ado, I present to you chapter 1. I hope my internet is stable enough that I don't cut out at all, but you guys will get the links to these recordings. This chapter addresses the sort of origins of biopsychology and leads us to our first discussion, which is nature and nurture. So during this, I will talk about what those things are and where the prompt for the discussion comes in. All right, so when we talk about biopsychology, first of all, it must be pointed out that psychology came from the teachings of philosophy. In philosophy, the great philosophers of our time and before our time, of course, gave the question of what is our purpose of life, what is our purpose on this planet, what is the meaning of life, and things like that. So the bigger thinker questions. And then eventually, that led to the more specific questions like, why do we do what we do? And that's where psychology comes in. When we get to the idea of biopsychology, we wonder about the biological makeup. So we ask questions like, are the brain and the mind two different things, or is the brain the same as the body? What is neuroscience? How do we use neuroscience to our advantage? And is there a difference between neuroscience and biopsychology? Well, in this case, neuroscience is really looking at the connection of the neurons and how they communicate and how that overall works on a sort of molecular level. So if I were to ask you something like, why does a certain brain circuit light up when you do this task if you're in an fMRI machine or something like that? So neuroscience is looking at the molecular level of what these things do, how they communicate. Biopsychology is more of what does it mean when that happens? So if I were to talk about a neurotransmitter called dopamine, which most of you have probably heard about, I would say, where does dopamine come from? And you would say it comes from an area in the midbrain called the VTA, or something like that. So in biopsychology, we would say, what does dopamine do? Dopamine causes problems with addiction. Dopamine is implicated in reward systems. Dopamine is implicated in a lot of different things, learning and stuff like that. So neuroscience is sort of the molecular level, and biopsychology is sort of, how does this make the person do what they do? What kinds of questions do neuroscientists study? They study what happens if this part of the brain is not working, what happens if there's too much or too little dopamine, right? In biopsychology, we kind of say, when you have that, this is what the corresponding behavior is for a person. So hopefully that clears it up. Maybe it doesn't, but throughout the course, hopefully you'll get a better understanding. Sometimes it's a little stubborn going forward. I'm trying to figure that out. Sorry, guys. And it's not working. Well, this is lovely. Let's try going back in. There we go. See if we can get something going now. I really don't want to have to start this over, but it seems not to be working. So what we'll do is we'll just click on the next one and hit back to present. Sorry for that. So one of the things I brought up about the origins of biopsychology, about the brain and its corresponding behavior, is that when it was looked at from a sort of philosophical point of view, and when the brain started being studied as a thing, we, thought about if the brain is part of the body or if the mind is different from the physical brain. So when we talk about the mind-brain problem, which started in philosophical times and has still continued throughout history, we have a pretty good conclusion these days. I don't want to spoil anything for you, but it was probably the biggest debate of what we would call biopsychology or neuroscience for many, many decades, many centuries. So the question is, what is the mind and what is its relationship to the brain? Well, we know from post-mortem tissue from dead bodies and going through autopsies and things like that, that the brain is actually there underneath the skull. We know that the brain has connections to the body and gives commands to the body. Everything that we do, everything we say, everything we taste, everything we feel, every muscle we move is dependent on the brain. All the five senses have to go up to the brain to be interpreted before we can know what we're doing, before we can feel, taste, touch, smell, see, anything. So we know that the brain is connected to the body in a biological way, but the mind, and this is where philosophy sort of, again, dug its nails in, is that the mind might be separate from the brain. And here we can point to things like conscious and unconscious responses. We can talk about dreams. We can talk about abstract thoughts that you didn't have before and all of a sudden they just popped into your head. Some people think psychic abilities is a thing. I do not. Sorry. So is it possible that the mind is where abstract thoughts comes from, imagination and things like that? And the brain is really telling the muscles what to do and interpreting our outside world. Well, those that believe that the mind and body or mind and brain are of the same substance and there is no metaphysical mind, these are called materialistic monists, or this is materialistic monism. They say that the brain is in control of everything, but it's all physical. There's no spiritual, metaphysical, otherworldly thing, kind of like what the soul would be. There were people that thought everything was in our mind and there was really no physical plane, which is really kind of Twilight Zone-y, right? That we're all mind and we're just sort of existing in this state. Now, that wasn't a very popular opinion, but probably the biggest opinion throughout history was that of dualism. And dualism says that the brain is physical and maybe it controls the body movements and things like that, but all of our thoughts and emotions and things that we can't explain are because the mind and brain are separate. And so maybe the mind is part of that, again, that idea with the soul, where when our physical body dies and our soul ascends to heaven or, maybe the bad place, that our mind is part of that. And in this dualist view, the brain can exist without the mind, and the mind can exist without the brain. So this one was heavily favored by a lot of people, but there were plenty of people that believed in the idea of monism. I don't know why I'm having such problems with going forward on these slides. I have no idea. So again, apologies. I feel like I'm using an old style slideshow. Click, 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 click. Sorry. We're gonna keep trying though. It's probably my computer. So before we move on from this whole idea of monism versus dualism, it is probably good to know, and it will come up in these slides, that most modern neuroscientists and biopsychologists these days believe in that materialistic monism, that our brain is the physical property that controls our body, and that the mind itself is more of just an idea. Do you have to believe that? No. I would have to say the number of people that do believe that is about 99%. So you could be part of the 1% if you'd like. But that's how it goes. So going through history, the mind-brain problem was still being debated. And in about the 1600s, a man named René Descartes, who you may know from the history books as one of the first people to say that the Earth is not the center of the universe and that it revolves around the sun. And sorry, flat earthers, but this guy had it right. Descartes was in his thinking space, I guess, or his writing space. He was at home, and there was a fountain outside of where he lived. And when he saw the fountain, it gave him an idea about maybe how the brain works. So he wasn't just your typical, looking at things from a perspective of Earth and the universe. He was also interested in the human brain. And so he thought, much like the water going through the fountain, he proposed this hydraulic model for the way that the brain works. He said that there is chemicals or some sort of water or some sort of substance that sort of flows through the brain. But he was a dualist. So he said that there was a part of the brain through which some type of animal spirit was able to flow through. And that's where the mind and the brain got to meet. And he called this part of the brain the seat of the soul. And this was a part of the brain towards the back called the pineal gland. Now, eventually this was rejected because scientists before psychology and before neuroscience discovered that the pineal gland is not where animal spirits from another area come in, but rather quite the opposite. The pineal gland is actually what makes you sleepy, because the pineal gland secretes this substance in your brain, this chemical called melatonin. Some of you guys may take this over the counter to try to help fall asleep. So this idea of a hydraulic model was eventually rejected because people were able to observe it. They were able to look at and check out and find out what the substance is. And it was definitely not some sort of spirit or animal type of thing. The reason that they were able to find this out is because at this time, the scientific method was underway in trying to understand what things were doing scientifically. So this was something we call empiricism. And empiricism said, if we have a question about the way the world works, the mind and the brain problem, which is a little bit harder to solve, we need to be able to observe what's happening and see if we were right. So basically, this idea is that you make a guess about something. The brain is part of the body. The brain and the mind are separate. And then you find or devise a way to observe and test what's going on. So this is really what led to that. This was still a few hundred years before, a couple hundred years at least, before psychology and neuroscience became a thing. If we fast forward with this idea of empiricism to the late 1800s, around 1879, 1880, in Leipzig, Germany, there was a man named Wilhelm Wundt, as you can see here. And Wundt founded the first psychology laboratory. He actually coined the term psychology, which was defined as the science of mental life. Why would he want it to be a science? Well, looking at this idea here of empiricism, he wanted to know about the mind or the brain, and he wanted to know specifically if he could observe and test and research these things to find out what makes humans do what they do. what makes humans upset and become violent? What makes humans do the things that they do? And that is where the focus shifted more specifically toward the mind or the brain or both. And again, this is not going forward. So, again, oh, we're here. Oops, it actually worked this time. My apologies. Again, technical difficulties. So, before we got to the point of Wundt and psychology, physiologists, doctors, needed to know about the brain, that wonderful thing that controls the body and makes it do basically everything. They wanted to know how it worked. In order to figure out the brain and mind dilemma, right? Is it all one? Is it dualist? Is it all just mind? They needed to figure out, poke and prod, and figure out how the brain actually worked. So, in the late 1700s, a man named Galvani was the first to discover that our brain actually runs on its own electrical activity. So it runs on its own electricity. So when Galvani got to, and even 100 plus years later, when Fritsch and Hitzig came around, what they were known for really is in the frontal lobe of the brain, there is a portion called the motor cortex, which basically sends signals from your brain to your muscles to tell them what to do. If you need to run a marathon, it sends a signal to your legs and your arms to do the right sequence of moves that allow you to run far. So in that time, it was believed that the brain was all electrical, and that sort of your neurons, your brain cells, were like circuits. They were all connected like wires, and the electrical activity, I can't speak tonight, the electrical activity would go from neuron to neuron until it got to the place that it needed to go, kind of like the electrical circuits that go into your light when it's plugged into the wall to allow your lamps to turn on or your TV to turn on or things like that. So for many, many years, we saw through research, through empirical evidence, right, that the brain ran on its own electricity. And they thought for a long time that this was the way it worked, like a circuit in your house. Helmholtz was the one that actually discovered the speed of electrical activity in your neurons. So between these researchers, they established that the neural conduction and it also established that neural functioning was more open to scientific study, because that was not always the main point for the brain to just run on electricity. There was speculation that it was more than just electricity. It's more than just like a simple circuit to your TV or to your light bulb. So let's see if this is actually going to work. No? Okay. I feel like it's like old school turning the page here. Turning the page in your books, kids. Sorry, I make really bad jokes a lot of times, and I have no apologies for them. So you're going to have to grin and bear it or just read. So in this time, the brain was becoming more and more popular as an area of study. Neuroscience had not been invented yet, but there were many, many people who were curious about the brain and how it functioned. The idea that the brain ran on electricity was one of many things. For instance, there were a lot of people that wondered if certain parts of the brain did specific things. This was an idea called localization. And localization really came about and sort of took over in neuroscience, or in study, with a man named Phineas Gage. And the video for Phineas Gage, for the video for his story, is included in this chapter, so you can go ahead and watch that after this lecture. But Phineas Gage was a man who was working on the railroad, and he was a blasting foreman. As they needed to expand trains across the US so people could travel. This was about the year 1849. And one day, a really bad day for Phineas Gage, is when one of the tampering rods that was blasted, the explosion was a little too big, and the rod went right through his eye and basically out his brain, out the top of his skull. Gage did not die, and instead, he ended up throwing up about a teacup's worth of brain matter when he got to the doctor's office. The fact that he didn't die was amazing enough, but what happened next was even more amazing. Different people had different accounts of what Phineas Gage went through, but basically some people said that he was hyper aggressive after the accident, sexually aggressive, violent. Other people said that he kind of lumbered around like a zombie and had no personality whatsoever. Now, doesn't matter who you believe, whichever way, whether he was too obnoxious, whether he was a zombie, because the bottom line is that he was not himself anymore. So it seemed that the specific part of the brain that was damaged in this accident, which went through his what we call frontal lobe, which would be, as you see the background, would be sort of over here, the front part of the brain, it changed his personality traits. So he was no longer Gage, as one of the famous doctors that he saw put it. That was sort of the biggest idea, the biggest piece of motivation for exploring the brain in more detail. And this idea of localization, which meant that certain specific parts of the brain had certain functions. Leading more steam to this was a man named Dr. Broca, Paul Broca. And one day, not too long after the Phineas Gage thing, probably about 5-10 years later, somebody came into Broca's office and basically couldn't speak. The belief is that this person had suffered a stroke, and if you don't know what a stroke actually is, it is a bleed in the brain or a blockage of blood flow in the brain. We'll get to that in chapter 3. And Broca said, "What seems to be the problem?" And the person probably said something like this, blah, 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 because they couldn't speak. Broca then found out what part of the brain on the left side of the brain was damaged and realized that that specific part of the brain must have been for producing speech. There was actually another doctor about 5 or 10 years after Broca named Wernicke, where a person came up to Dr. Wernicke and they were able to talk, but it made no sense. So they were able to say words, but they couldn't understand when people were talking to them. And so that part of the brain seemed to be not for speech production, like Paul Broca said, but for speech comprehension. So we'll get to that more in chapter 9. So with Phineas Gage, with Broca and Wernicke, in the mid to late 1800s, there was a lot of momentum with this idea of localization. In fact, towards the late 1800s, based on this stuff, there was a man named Franz Gall. And Franz Gall had what we like to call a wrong-headed theory. Franz Gall said that the different parts of the brain were very specific to your personality traits. And understandably so, right? With Phineas Gage, he took a rod to the frontal lobe, and all of a sudden his personality completely changed, whichever way you believe. So Gall, his extreme theory of localization led to, around the same time as psychology, a different branch called phrenology. And phrenology, if you've never heard of it, was reading the bumps on your skull. So what Gall said, by the way, this is Paul Broca on the right over here. What Gall said is that the different parts of your brain correspond to different personality traits, whether you're outgoing or shy, whether you're ambitious or just lazy and lack motivation or things like that. And he said that the bumps on your skull, he could read them, and whatever part of the brain had sort of a bump sticking out of the skull, that part of the brain of that personality trait was more pronounced. So if you had a bump towards the front, he might say that you were more ambitious. Or if you had a bump towards the back, it might mean you were more sort of domestic, able to follow directions and take orders, right? And of course, kind of like with Descartes and his whole hydraulic system of the brain, this was eventually rejected. So he got it really wrong as far as being the specific parts of the brain being personality traits, as we'll find out later, but that the certain parts of the brain do different things that have to do with the five senses and things like that. So we call it a wrong-headed theory because he was right about localization, that specific parts of the brain do specific things, and we can actually use these ideas of electricity to show this, but they do not pertain to your personality traits. And on top of that, if you know anything about the anatomy of the brain, there's actually a layer of liquid called cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, that is in between the skull and your brain. It's sort of this fluid that protects the brain from, when you get hit in the head or, things like that. It's also useful for bringing nutrients in to help the brain function and taking out, in the same way, the some of the bad stuff or dead cells or things like that. And it rolls through like a fountain. So maybe if Descartes was alive, he would have been happy to know about cerebrospinal fluid, because it is kind of a hydraulic system for the brain, not in the way that Descartes thought about it, which was animal spirits. So if you want to know more about phrenology, you can go to this page, phrenology.org, and it'll tell you all about it. So therefore, the bumps on the skull are not actually touching the brain. So I'm sorry to say, Mr. Gall or Dr. Gall, your theory was not quite correct. Ooh, it worked again. So going beyond, as we got through the 1800s into the 1900s, and this was around 1940 or 1950, there was a man named Carl Lashley who was, now this is where neuroscience was sort of taking off. It had gotten its sea legs, so to speak. It had gained momentum with the cases of Broca's patient, Wernicke's patient, of course, Mr. Phineas Gage. And now people were specifically studying the brain and its communication and its connections and all of that. So while localization was still very strong, Lashley said that if you destroy parts of the brain, certain parts of the brain, which is what happened to those other poor fellas, that it basically renders it, that localization idea, it renders that part of the brain useless. But it's the extent of the damage, Lashley said, not necessarily the location, that determines how much function is lost. So what this means is, this idea of equipotentiality said, not only is it localization, so if you look down below, you can see here in blue is Broca's area on the left side of the brain only, and here, down here in orange is Wernicke's area. So not only does if you damage this part of the brain, like a stroke or something like that, not only does this part of the brain get destroyed, but anything that it sort of connects to with neurons, right? So if you only lose a little bit of this, you may not lose speech function altogether. But if you lose the whole thing, you may not only just lose speech, but you may lose the ability to understand speech and not just speak it, or whatever this connects to. Are you losing speech in this case because you're just damaging this part of the brain, or does this part of the brain also, dictate what muscles in your mouth move? So maybe you can talk, you just can't move the right muscles, right? So this is the idea of equipotentiality. So not only is it localization, but it's also what we call distribution of function. In our brain, what we have learned is that there are circuits. There are neurons that connect to other neurons, or parts of the brain that connect to other parts. Obviously, in language, which we'll go over in chapter 9, Broca and Wernicke's areas work together. In Broca's area, that's actually producing speech. In Wernicke's area, that is understanding speech, right? Because you can understand something without being able to speak it, or you can speak in what's known as what they called word salad. So you would say words that just wouldn't make any sense together. Purple monkey dishwasher. You'll hear that again in chapter 9. Sorry, I just like that phrase for no reason. And of course, when you're reading, or when somebody's talking, if somebody's deaf and you're reading sign language, your visual system is also going to combine with that. So there has to be some circuit that includes speaking, understanding it, either written on paper, which uses your visual system, or just hearing it, which is the auditory system. And you can see hearing is right here next to Wernicke's area. So this idea of equipotentiality means that not only are you damaging that part of the brain, but whatever it connects to as well, that signal is probably going to be lost. And let's go to the next one manually. Again, my apologies for technical difficulties. So, some people still debate the mind-brain problem. It is the oldest of the debates, but I think it kind of takes a backseat to one of the other ones, which we'll get to in a little bit. There is a place called the Discovery Institute, which promotes the idea of intelligent design, meaning that we're all mind. This is the non-material view. And this institute funds the 1% of people that still believe everything is made up in our mind. We're all just sort of in the matrix kind of type of thing. So we call those non-material neuroscientists. So this is monism, but this is the non-material view. And 99% of neuropsychologists, neuroscientists, biopsychologists, and people that work with the brain are what we call materialist monists, right? Those are the ones that believe and have seen, because again, it's all about research and empiricism. And what research tells us is that the brain is connected to the body, and we can basically map out what's going on. There's still many things about the brain that we don't know, but from what we do know, it seems to support this idea that the brain and the body are made of the same material. And even though we have abstract thoughts or deja vu or things that, some people feel can't be explained, doesn't mean that the mind is separate from the brain. So the non-materialists would say things like, if you go to psychotherapy, it changes your brain activity. And this is evidence, because we're not manipulating things in your brain. This is evidence of the mind, something metaphysical, something out there in the universe, changing the brain. So makes a good point, I guess, right? Psychotherapy changes brain activity. That's your mind changing your brain. We're not manipulating. We're not giving drugs, right? We're not doing anything like that. And you can see changes taking place. So, maybe it's understandable from the non-materialist point of view. Yeah, I guess the mind could be changing the brain. Well, how can we debate that? How can you say that it's something else? Well, what's the materialist neuroscientist response? That the brain changes the brain. If you think differently, if you behave differently, if you are interacting differently, learning new things, These are all things that causes the brain to change itself. When we learn, as we're going to talk about in chapter 12, we can see physical proof in the brain of learning and memorying, something that we call LTP, or long-term potentiation. So be on the lookout for that later down the line in the last module. Hoping that my computer follows suit, but it does not. So hope everybody's having a good day, evening, morning, whenever you're watching this. And I will just keep plugging along, slide by slide if I need to. So the mind-brain problem seems to have been solved for the most part. Overwhelmingly, when we talk about research, it's because we're able to actually manipulate things and actually look at things the way they are. So the mind-brain problem has kind of taken a back seat, although it's still being debated a little bit today. We have a 99% consensus rate. But this leads us to our biggest question in probably all of psychology, and not just neuroscience. This involves asking how much of who we are, personality, behavior, quirks, right, things like that, how many of these things are influenced by what we're born with, our genetics, and how much of it is our influences around us in shaping our overall behavior and personality. So nature is the things that we get from mom and dad, right? That's our biological basis. That is your genetic output. So I know a lot of people think about hair color, eye color, height, body type, right? Things like that, that are your makeup, right? Your genetic makeup. That's your nature. Nurture, of course, is everything that comes after you're born. All of your experiences, the way you're raised, the things that you gravitate towards or away from. So the question is, surrounding this, there's a whole discussion, the whole debate. That's why this is our first discussion, is how important are these environmental influences? How important is our nurture in shaping behavior? And how important is our nature in shaping behavior? How much of who we are, how we behave, what our personality is like, what we become is based on our nature, and how much of it is based on the things that we learn, the people we're around, the experiences we have. That's our nurture. Now, some of you guys, especially if you had me for Psych 1, have done this before. A lot of times when people do this, right, their arguments are based on their emotions. You guys are potentially fairly new at reading research reports. I'm not asking you to do that right here, but maybe, when you're looking for an answer, it's based on your personal experience, which we wouldn't call empirical evidence, right? And it's based on things that you may have witnessed or other people that you may know. And so we get a lot of arguments that are based on emotion and not necessarily the evidence or the science. Now, I don't want to inundate you with a bunch of things, so I'm not going to do that until after our debate is done, because I get to interact with you. But it's a good idea to think about that. And maybe you have an opinion, and maybe by the end of class, I can potentially change that opinion in one way or another. I'm not going to try to change your opinion, but maybe through the evidence of research and things that the textbook tells us and my lectures, that you may have a different opinion. Or you may be there now and not changing. But I will tell you this, obviously this class is a standpoint of biology. It's more from the nature standpoint than the nurture standpoint. So remember that an increasing number of behaviors are turning out to have some degree of hereditary influence. And again, I'm not going to go into this right now because we have the chance to discuss it. You'll see what my percentages are. But the first discussion asks you guys, if you were to give a percentage to how much of who you are, what you do, your personality is influenced by genetics or nature, and how much of it is nurture. It might be easy for you to say, oh, well, maybe it's 50-50. Or maybe some people say it's, 60-40, 70-30. I'm not looking for a very specific, 73%, 27% type of thing. You can use fives or zeros and just kind of give me a ballpark figure. But before we get into this, because I want to, go through some more of this, it's necessary to understand exactly what we mean when we say nature and nurture. So what are nature and heredity, and what does it mean for nurture? As we turn the page. This gets really annoying, doesn't it? So, when we talk about nature, we're talking about what is biologically inherited from your parents and your family. When we talk about genetics, what is genetics? What is a gene? Well, a gene is defined as the fundamental unit of inheritance from your mom and from your dad. 50% of your genes are made up of genetic traits that come from your mom and 50% from your dad. Can they give you different versions, different sequences of genes? Absolutely. There are many different sequences. These individual genes are found within a bigger region called chromosomes. And here is what the chromosomes look like. We have 23 pairs of two chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. 22 pairs of regular chromosomes in which the genes are located within these little chromosomes. And these genes are genetic sequences of these little things called nucleotides. And the 23rd is our sex chromosome. So XX, here's the X chromosome, and if you put two of these together, it looks like an X. So there is XX, which produces the characteristics of females, and there's XY, which produces the characteristics of males. Obviously, females, we have the wider hips, you have more estrogen, you have breasts. With males, of course, you have penis and testicles, you have more testosterone, sperm producing, and things like that. Now, this has been known for many years, and I'm not going to go off on a tangent, but when we talk about binary versus non-binary, if you've ever heard of this term sexually, because people are often not understanding how people can be transgender and be assigned one gender at birth and then feel like another. They think it's not real, it's made up, or things like that. So you're assuming that XX and XY are the only two. When you hear binary, it means one or the other, right? You're either female or you're male. Well, think about how many males that may not be gay, but may be very sort of feminine, which is sort of a characteristic, or females that might be tomboys, and this is not even to say that these are not heterosexual. And then, of course, we have gay, lesbian, transgender, right? All of those things. So what this tells us, and what I'm about to go into, is that it's not just one gene or something like that that makes you male or female. There are many other things that go into that. So that's why when we say that being gay is not a choice, it is a set of chromosomes and genetics all together that sort of make you who you are. So it's very easy from my standpoint to see that somebody could be assigned male at birth but have other characteristics that come from other genes combined that make them feel like they are female in a male's body, or vice versa, or many other. So we say that there's fluidity in gender because it's not just the sex chromosomes. It's not just one gene on these chromosomes that makes you either male or female. So hopefully that clears things up a little bit. And now my slideshow seems to be working a little bit more. So when we get into this idea of nature and nurture, right, one of the things we need to understand is how these genes actually get in there to make up the genome, to make up this person's genetic makeup. Well,
I'm not going to go through the sex education of it, but when the egg is fertilized between the male and female, it creates, once the egg is fertilized, you have what's called a zygote. It's not quite a human being yet, but it is starting to form that way. And what makes this happen is that the sperm fertilizes the egg. And so from the sperm, you get 23 chromosomes. Remember, there's 23 pairs. From the egg, you get 23 chromosomes. And that combines to be 46 chromosomes, 23 from mom, 23 from dad. In the first 8 weeks of life, your cells are basically doing math. They're multiplying and dividing in half and multiplying as they do that. So your cells are becoming part of you. In each of these cells that become the human being, become a child eventually, there is a copy of your DNA, all your genes in your genetic sequence. And that's in the first 8 weeks of life. So by the way, and yeah, I'm going to go on my high horse a little bit here. There are many places like Alabama and Arkansas and places down in the South that have been trying to incorporate laws making it harder and harder for somebody to get an abortion, especially after a certain time. They had what's called a heartbeat law that says that you can detect a heartbeat within 6 weeks of pregnancy, and once the child has a heartbeat, there can be no termination. Well, for the first 8 weeks of life, it's still an embryo. It's still not even fully formed into what we would even think of as a human fetus, maybe after 8 weeks. And that sound that people claim to be a heartbeat is actually just the electromagnetic pulse from the ultrasound machine. So yeah, it kind of sounds like a heartbeat, but it's not. So does that mean that a woman who's 6 weeks pregnant can use the carpool lane, and if she were to try to get a ticket, she could say, "Well, there's a heartbeat." Okay, I'm gonna stop there, but you understand what I'm saying. From a scientific point of view, 8 weeks may be the earliest where we would call it an actual fetus or human being, right? Um, but that's just me again being on my horse. So I like being on my high horse sometimes. Sometimes it gets me in trouble. So from 8 weeks to birth, obviously the child is growing, the fetus is turning into a baby, and all of those genes are allowing for the makeup of the child at first. No? Well, we had a good run of 2 or 3 slides, and now we go back to manual. Again, my apologies. So getting back to this idea of genetics, your genes are made up of these double-stranded chains of proteins called nucleotides. And the sequence of these nucleotides basically tells you your genetic makeup. So that is your DNA. And again, your DNA is found in every cell in your body, especially in all the brain cells, which we call neurons. It's a double-stranded chain, so 2 sets of proteins that go together. The bases are A, T, G, and C. This is what we call the genetic alphabet. Adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. No, I will not ask you to spell those out. And those are the genetic alphabets. As you can see from the picture on the right, thymine and adenine go together. I could make a bad joke about T and A, or A and T. And G and C, C and G go together. So whatever sequence on the left, if it's a T, it's going to go with an A. If it's a C, it's going to go with a G, and vice versa. As you can see down here, A with T, C with G, G with C, T with A. And some of these genes have a very long sequence of these nucleotides. Some of them have a very short sequence. And the difference between a shorter and a longer one could be the difference between having red hair and brown hair, or blonde hair, having blue eyes versus green eyes, maybe even being left-handed and right-handed. but it's not a single gene that determines all of these things. So keep that in mind as well. The cool thing about genetics is that they've been studied since the 1940s or 50s, and around the turn of the century, around 2000, the human genome has pretty much been mapped out completely using computer simulations and things like that. So the nice thing about this is that we've been able to map the entire human genome. Are there still genes that we're not sure what they do? Kind of. Have we ever found a gene for being gay? The gay gene, so to speak? No. But again, a lot of times what we see in people's behaviors or their personality traits or their genetic or physical makeup, short, tall, um, things like that, better athletic ability, not so much athletic ability, things like that can be the different sequences of these genes. So we also have different versions of the gene, right? So there's a version of a gene that people would be left-handed versus right-handed, blue eyes versus brown eyes, things like that. So these different versions of the genes that you could have are called alleles. And alleles together can determine certain characteristics. One of them would be blood type. We have A, we have B, we have AB, and then we have O. Some of them could be specific determinants of genes could tell you whether or not you have a specific psychological or medical disorder, like Huntington's disease. Now, Huntington's disease is actually one of the rare exceptions of one single gene that causes a change. Whether you have it or not is dependent on one single gene. Most of the others are the makeup of more than one gene. So we'll get to that. So in this case, one on each chromosome. So you have an allele from mom and an allele from dad. There are two different types of alleles, and you may have heard of this in a biology or science class. You may not have. We have dominant and we have recessive. So again, you get one allele from mom, one allele from dad, and the combination together makes up you. Dominant alleles, which are denoted in a capital R, are expressed if you have one or if you have two dominant alleles, you're going to always show the dominant trait. So in this case, A or B blood type, if all you need is one dominant trait, even if one is recessive, and you will have that. People who have type O have two recessive traits. So dominant will be dominant if you have two dominants or one dominant. You're going to get A or B blood type. If you have a recessive gene, again, if you only have one recessive gene and one dominant, it's going to show the dominant trait. Right-handedness is a dominant trait. So if you have one parent that's right-handed and the other parent that is right-handed, even if they have a recessive trait, they're going to show right-handedness. Recessive traits are only shown when you have two recessive traits. So I am left-handed, which means that there had to have been a recessive trait from my dad and a recessive trait from my mom. Now, in my dad's side of the family, I have a lot more in common. I look like my dad's side of the family. Most of my dad, my grandfather, my uncle, all left-handed. So it seems to be, for me, more of my dad's genes expressed than my mom's. So only if you have two recessive traits will you have type O blood or be left-handed for argument's sake. So we use the terms homozygous and heterozygous. Hetero means both, one of each. So if you have, again, the one dominant allele, one recessive allele for blood, you're going to show the dominant trait if you're heterozygous. Homozygous dominant, obviously you're going to show the dominant trait. The only time you're going to get type O blood or left-handedness is if you have a double recessive trait. So homozygous recessive. Hopefully that is understandable. I've also written this out, like I said, on the page, so you can read it if my words are not necessarily ringing right away in your ears. We also look at your genotype versus your phenotype. The genotype is your genetic makeup. So if I was to say that I am heterozygous for blood, that tells me I have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. My phenotype is my physical characteristics, what it actually translates to. So my genotype is heterozygous, one dominant allele, one recessive allele for blood type, and that shows that I am type A blood. Even though I may have one dominant and one recessive gene, I'm still going to show the dominant gene, A blood type. If somebody has two recessive genes, like I do for handedness, then I will be left-handed. So the genotype is the genetic makeup, dominant, recessive alleles. Phenotype is what you physically look like, or the physical makeup. Type A blood, type O blood, left-handed, right-handed, right? Things like that. Dark hair versus blonde hair, or et cetera, et cetera. Whether you have a disease or whether you don't, stuff like that. We also have X-linked traits. Remember that women are XX and men are XY. So in men, these traits are unpaired. You can either be affected with this trait or not. Women who have XX can be completely normal. They can be a carrier. So here, there was a man who discovered genetics and genetic traits named Gregor Mendel in the 1800s. And Gregor Mendel came up with this idea of, let's look at these boxes, these squares. He called them Mendelian squares because his last name was Mendel and he could do that. Just like Broca was the first person to find out that that area of the brain causes people to not be able to speak. So he was the first to discover it. He got to call it Broca's area. If there is indeed a part of the brain that has been undiscovered and one of you guys discovers it first, you get to put your name on it too. So these are what we call Mendelian, basically squares, right? Mendelian traits. Looking at blood type in the children of two sets of parents. Both sets of parents have type A blood. Here on the left, we see capital A, which means dominant, dominant, right? Remember that O is the recessive. So one parent, we'll call this mom, is what we call homozygous dominant, has two of the same, right? Homo means the same. So two dominant alleles for A. Dad, on the other hand, is what we call heterozygous. He's got one allele that's dominant for type A and one allele that's recessive for type O. Again, if you're heterozygous, you're still going to have the phenotype of the dominant trait. So you are type A. If we were to look at the chances of children, again, we have one dominant homozygous dominant and one heterozygous. There is no chance for type O blood in any of the offspring. Here we have AA, you're going to be homozygous dominant. Another child would be AA, homozygous dominant. And if we get to this side, we have AO, which is heterozygous. You're still going to have the dominant trait. So type A it's going to be. And again, same thing here. There is no chance with only one recessive trait between both parents. There is no chance to be type O blood. Here, for these parents, we see that they're both heterozygous, which means they're both going to show the dominant type A blood, but because there's a recessive trait from mom and a recessive trait from dad, you have about a 25% chance, a 1 in 4 chance of having a child that shows both recessive traits. So if we look again at the numbers, or letters in this case, AA is going to be a homozygous dominant. AO, heterozygous, is going to still show type A blood. AO here, or OA, is going to, again, heterozygous, is going to show the dominant trait. And 1 out of 4 chance for children is going to show OO. So you have a 1 in 4 chance with two heterozygous parents. There's a 1 in 4 chance of showing having a type O blood child, or a left-handed child in this case. Now my dad was left-handed, so my dad would have been OO, and my mom would have been, basically AO in this case. For handedness, you would say LL and then maybe RL, something like that. So my brother, who was born first, he's right-handed. I was born second. I am left-handed. My brother physically looks like my mom's side of the family, looks just like my mom, and I look just like my father's side of the family, specifically my grandfather, actually, more than my dad. So now you know. Yeah. Oh, it worked again. Yay. So, again, there are certain traits, certain things, maybe like handedness and stuff like that, um, that are determined by one single pair of alleles, by one gene. This is very rare. So, again, when you think of binary, when we talk about gender and sex, it's not just so simple as XX or XY, which is what people thought it was for many, many years, because most characteristics are determined by several genes and hence are referred to as polygenic. Poly meaning many, and genic meaning genes. So things like your height, your intelligence level, skin color. Some people have a little bit lighter skin, darker skin. Some people can tan really easily. I go straight from white to red and back to white again. There's not much tanning in my lack of skin. They call it fair skin. I call it unfair skin. There is, again, only one psychological disorder here that is determined by one gene, and it's actually called the Huntington gene. That is Huntington's disease. Now, if you guys have ever seen the show House, especially in the last like 3 seasons of it, there was a character that he called 13, played by Olivia Wilde, and in that, her mom had Huntington's disease, and there was a whole part of that talking about how she may or may not have it. The test that they do is determined by the sequence of genes in that one, sequence of nucleotides, right? Those CGAT, in that one Huntington's gene in the 4th chromosome. But every other psychological disorder, from depression to anxiety, schizophrenia, right? You name it, ADHD, whatever it is going to be a result of definitely more than one gene interacting with each other. So there's a nice saying that genes do not provide a script for behavior, but they only control the production of proteins. However, if we know that genes make up your physical makeup, height, maybe your metabolism, hair color, all of those things, intelligence, we also know that they are making up some of your personality traits. That's why if you have a father who is very outgoing and social, and a mother who might be very outgoing and social, chances are you're going to be outgoing and social, extroverted. If your parents are introverted, you may have more of a chance of being introverted. For me, my mom was actually very extroverted. My dad was very introverted. And even though I have a lot of physical characteristics like my dad's side of the family and a lot of genetic traits, I seem to get that outgoing behavior from my mom's side of the family. Sorry, now I jumped the gun and it won't let me go back, will it? Oh, there it is. So, it keeps jumping back and forth. My apologies. At least it's actually working without me going back out. And I just jinxed it. So, let's go back really quick. And you can just see that they don't provide a script for behavior. They just control the production of proteins. So maybe this gives you a little bit of fuel for the nature debate. Again, I talked about the Human Genome Project, which started in 1999 and basically was mapped out by 2003. But again, we still don't know every single gene, what every single gene does, or how these genes interact. So we were able to identify the entire genome which is all the chromosomes, all the genes in our chromosomes. And what that map revealed actually is that 97% of our DNA, almost all of it, is non-protein encoding. But what they do is they have a role in how much the gene is expressed. So there are genes that code for our neurotransmitters. There are genes that how much or how little we may have. If you guys know about chemical imbalances, a lot of talk about depression is a lower amount of serotonin. Well, some people may have just been born with less serotonin production in their brain than others. And this is where we talk about gene expression, right? People who have anxiety, sweat the small stuff, people who get depressed easy rather than people who seem to have more resilience and are able to look at the bright side and be positive as opposed to being negative and viewing the world in that way. So a lot of it is gene expression and the interaction of genes with one another. And let's see if this works now. So with Gregor Mendel and his genetics, and borrowing from our good friend Charles Darwin and his natural selection, what Darwin came up with is that with all of the genes, by the way, there are over 30,000 genes in the genome with different alleles for each one, different sequences of your nucleotides. Some are longer, some are shorter, and things like that. Doing the math on this shows that there are somewhere between 60 and 70 trillion possible genetic combinations from two parents. So a lot of times the argument of nurture over nature, or being a higher percentage, is based on the fact that they say, well, we grew up in the same home with the same values and things like that, and I learned, I am who I am because of the things that I learned and the way that my parents raised me and things like that. Well, if we have such a huge diverse amount of genetic possibilities from two parents, how do you explain multiple siblings acting completely different and behaving different and having different um, introverted versus extroverted from the same set of parents? Again, genetically, the possibilities are endless. My brother and I are very different. There are things we have in common, but our genetic makeup seems to be pretty different from one another. So, what Darwin would say is that sexual reproduction increases the variability. It increases this um, variance in your genetics, which is an essential component of his natural selection. Individuals whose genes provide them with a greater ability to adapt to their environment, especially if that environment changes, they are able to survive, and they're able to pass off these genes to more. There are some people in this world today where I'm not so sure how they made it this far, or if they will continue to make it much farther. Wear a mask, people. Um, so, a little joke there, but also not really a joke. So, finishing up, and of course, my slideshow won't let me. Once again, oh, there it is. It let me. I'm just a little impatient, I guess. What this tells us is that a lot of our characteristics, genetics, personality traits are based on our parents and heritability. And this is one of the other things that we use to sort of fuel this nature-nurture debate is twin studies. Now, you guys probably know the difference between fraternal twins and identical twins. Identical twins are the ones that look exactly like each other, carbon copy. They can only be male-male or female-female. If it is a male-female combination, it is fraternal twins. The difference between identical twins and fraternal twins from a genetic standpoint is that identical twins seem to come from one egg and one sperm that splits in half. And so basically you have a carbon copy of one another. So therefore, they share 100% of their genes. Whereas fraternal twins just happen to be two eggs and two sperm that get fertilized at the same time. So they don't share one egg and one sperm. They're actually two different. It's like having a brother or sister that's older or younger, but at the same time. So they're more like womb mates. They just share a womb, but they're not sharing all of their DNA. So they seem to be about 50%, which is what a typical brother sister sibling would be. They're just born at the same time. If we saw evidence that nature may exist a little more on that spectrum than nurture, or at least 50-50, you would see differences in twin studies. And this is exactly what we see. So looking at the heredity of nature and nurture, right? Looking at the percentage of people that get, let's use schizophrenia as an example. What we find is that if you have a regular brother or sister, or a fraternal twin, dizygotic is called a fraternal twin, two zygotes. You're If one twin gets schizophrenia, the percentage chance of the other twin getting schizophrenia is about 17%. Now, that may not sound like a lot, especially for a twin of some sort, but the population, the general population, and we'll go over this in the last chapter, is about 1% of the population, 1 in every 100 people. So considering that if 1% is the rate of schizophrenia, 17% chance is 17 times higher in a fraternal twin. If you were to use an identical twin, one identical twin has schizophrenia, the chances that the other one gets it is not 100%, because it's not all based on, just genetics and DNA. There is some variability, but you would see a lot higher percentage. So fraternal twins, 17%, identical twins, 51% chance. If one twin that's identical develops schizophrenia, has schizophrenia, is diagnosed with it, the chances the other twin will have it are over 50%, which, if you do the math, 51 is 3 times higher than 17. So right there we see that genetics seems to play a role in some of these things. Intelligence, personality traits, obviously physical characteristics, height, blood type, right? Handedness, things like that. But it also goes for personality traits. So this last slide tells us that there is a lot of variability in our behavioral characteristics, which means that there is an interaction between your genetic makeup and your environmental influences. So one of the things we know for sure is that it'll never be 100 and 0 in this case. It will never be nature or nurture, but instead it's more of a percentage. So is it 50-50? Is it 60-40 one way or the other? What we know about vulnerability and this idea heredity, vulnerability, is that if you have more genes for a disorder, it reduces the threshold required to produce it. That's why some people can have an experience that doesn't qualify as traumatic, and other people, that same experience will cause PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Or things like that. So in your discussion, for the first discussion, I want you to give me an idea of what percentage do you think of your behavior or our behavior as humans is nature, genetics, heredity, all of these things that we just talked about, and how much of it is nurture based on your surroundings. Most scientists, by the way, reject this idea of nature versus nurture because really, again, spoiler alert, at the end of the day, you need both. So does it really matter which is the percentage that's more and which is the percentage that's less, or whether it's 50-50? They try to call it, they try to refer to it as nature and nurture. So with that in mind, welcome to biopsychology. When we get into chapter 2, we're going to get into the major building block of the nervous system, which is the neuron, what it's made up of, what different types of neurons there are, and how they communicate. I did tell you that electricity is a big part of the equation, but it's not the whole equation. In fact, I talked about chemicals. So stay tuned for chapter 2 when you're ready, and we will learn about how neurons communicate using both electrical activity and chemical messengers. And I am just checking to make sure that this is indeed the last slide, and I'm fairly certain that it is. So, in the famous words of me, I will talk to you guys soon.